In the remote Ozark Hills of Stone County, Missouri, where fog clings to hollows so thick you can't see your own hands, there stood a farm that locals learned to avoid mentioning. The year was 1883, and on 240 acres of rocky isolation, two farmer brothers built something they called their breeding barn, a name that would make seasoned lawmen refuse to speak of what they found inside. 42 women arrived at that property over 6 years, lured by promises of marriage and prosperity. Not one was ever seen in town again. But these brothers kept meticulous records of everything, a ledger so detailed, so horrifyingly clinical in its documentation of systematic evil, that it became the most damning piece of evidence in American criminal history. What drove respectable, church-going men to transform women into livestock? How did they hide their operation in plain sight while an entire community turned blind eyes to mounting disappearances? And what was discovered in that barn, carved into walls, buried in ravines, preserved in a perpetrator's own handwriting, that finally brought terrible justice crashing down? The story I'm about to tell reveals how evil documented becomes evil condemned, and why one survivor's courage ensured these monsters faced the rope they deserved. Prepare yourself for what's coming next, because the truth buried in those Ozark Hills will test everything you thought you knew about human darkness. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if you're brave enough for this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. October 1883. A woman staggers into the mining settlement of Galena, Missouri. Population 437, her feet leaving bloody prints on the wooden sidewalk outside Doc Yates's office. She is barefoot, her dress torn and filthy, her blonde hair matted with leaves and dirt. Most disturbing to the men who gather around her are her wrists, raw and infected, marked by deep grooves, consistent with prolonged restraint by iron chains. She gives her name as Lucinda May Garrett, age 24, originally of Philadelphia, and tells a story so horrific that Sheriff Horace Mundy immediately dismisses her as a lunatic or worse, suggesting she is probably a prostitute inventing tales to extract money from respectable farmers. But Dr. Hiram Yates, examining her injuries in his clinic, finds evidence that transforms her testimony from hysterical accusation into medical fact. The groove marks on her wrists are months old, healed, and reopened multiple times, indicating long-term captivity. Her feet are shredded from walking 18 miles through Ozark wilderness without shoes. Most significantly, she is approximately 4 months pregnant, and her body shows signs of severe malnutrition and repeated trauma. Yates documents everything in his medical ledger, dated the 23rd of October 1883, creating the first official record of what investigators would later call the most systematic abduction operation in American frontier history. Lucinda's account, transcribed by Yates because Sheriff Mundy refuses to take a statement, describes two brothers named Virgil and Amos Kern, who operate a farm 18 miles north in Piney Creek Hollow. She claims she responded to a matrimonial advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper in May 1882, corresponding with Virgil Kern, who presented himself as a prosperous, educated farmer seeking a virtuous wife. The letters, she insists, were eloquent and persuasive, promising security and family life she could never afford as a seamstress earning $4 weekly. She arrived at the Kern farm in August 1882, expecting courtship and marriage. Instead, on her second night, the younger brother Amos, who never speaks, dragged her from the farmhouse to a barn 400 yards into the woods. There, Virgil explained with complete calm that she had been purchased for breeding purposes and would serve until she proved productive or was disposed of. Yates writes down her words exactly as she speaks them, noting in his medical record that she shows no signs of insanity or deception, only profound trauma from extended ordeal. She describes 14 months of captivity in what the brothers called their breeding barn, chained in a wooden stall, subjected to systematic rape by Virgil on a schedule he documented in a ledger. She speaks of other women held in adjacent stalls, rotated in and out, some pregnant, some killed, when they failed to conceive after 6 months. Yates records her statement that she personally witnessed Amos murder 3 women with a hammer, dragging their bodies away at night. She escaped during a barn fire. Virgil accidentally started while burning field debris, the distraction allowing her to pull free from a rusted chain bolt and run. Dr. Yates knows something Sheriff Mundy apparently does not. 3 families in Stone County have filed missing persons inquiries about daughters who went to marry Virgil Kern and subsequently vanished without sending letters home. The last inquiry came just 6 weeks earlier from a farmer named Sadler, whose daughter supposedly married Virgil in August. No one has seen her since. Yates also recalls Reverend Krebs mentioning, during a disturbing conversation in 1881, that he once heard what sounded like a woman crying for help from the Kern barn, though Virgil had explained it away as a distressed sow. These fragments, dismissed individually as coincidence or misunderstanding, suddenly form a pattern when Lucinda Garrett staggers into town with chains marks on her wrists. Marshal Clayton Birch in Springfield, bypassing the local sheriff entirely, explaining that he has a credible witness to multiple murders and a possible mass grave situation requiring federal investigation. He includes his medical documentation, copies of local missing persons inquiries, and a detailed map showing the Kern property's isolated location. He marks his letter urgent and sends it by express rider, knowing that every day of delay might mean another woman dies in that breeding barn. Marshal Clayton Birch receives Yates's letter on the 26th of October, 1883, and immediately recognizes something that isolated rural doctors and sheriffs cannot see. Birch maintains files on missing persons cases across Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas, part of his former Pinkerton training to recognize patterns across jurisdictions. He pulls 14 case files from his cabinet, all dating from 1877 to 1883, all involving women who disappeared after responding to matrimonial advertisements or domestic service offers in Missouri. The women range in age from 19 to 34. All were unmarried, widowed, or economically desperate. All sent optimistic letters home describing their upcoming travel to Missouri, then complete silence. Birch spreads the files across his desk and begins cross-referencing details. 9 of the 14 cases include preserved copies of the matrimonial advertisements that lured the women west. Every single advertisement contains the same phrase, buried in flowery language about farm prosperity and family building, seeking virtuous woman for prosperous Missouri farm and family establishment. 7 advertisements are signed with initials V.E.K. 4 others use the name Virgil Kern directly. Birch has found his pattern. documented across 7 years and multiple states, linking back to one isolated Ozark farm. On October 28, Birch takes the train to Galena with 3 federal deputies and enough documentation to obtain a federal search warrant from the district judge in Springfield. He interviews Lucinda Garrett personally, and her testimony matches physical evidence in ways that hysterical invention cannot fabricate. She describes the layout of the breeding barn in precise detail, the number of stalls, the type of chains, the specific location of the ravine where Amos dumped bodies. She provides names and descriptions of 5 other women she encountered during her captivity, women who arrived after her, and some who were killed before her eyes. Birch checks his missing persons files. 3 of the 5 names Lucinda provides match his cases exactly, women from Boston, Philadelphia, and New York who disappeared in 1882 and 1883. The probability of Lucinda fabricating this is statistically impossible. Birch knows he is not investigating isolated disappearances. He is investigating systematic abduction, captivity, and murder spanning at minimum 6 years, and he has enough documented evidence to obtain federal jurisdiction based on interstate transportation for immoral purposes and postal fraud. He assembles 6 armed deputies and rides toward Piney Creek Hollow at dawn on the 29th of October, 1883, carrying arrest warrants for Virgil Elam Kern and Amos Trask Kern on preliminary charges of kidnapping and assault. He does not yet have proof of murder, but he knows that Breeding Barn will provide all the evidence justice requires. Evil documented becomes evil condemned, and the Kern brothers have been documenting their crimes meticulously for years, never imagining their own records would seal their fate. Marshal Clayton Birch and 6 federal deputies arrive at the Kern farmstead at dawn on the 29th of October, 1883, riding up a treacherous wagon road through dense oak forest that confirms Lucinda Garrett's description of the property's brutal isolation. The main farmhouse sits on a cleared hillside, modest but well-maintained, with split-rail fencing and cultivated fields that suggest prosperity rather than depravity. Virgil Elam Kern emerges onto the porch before the lawmen even dismount, and his appearance contradicts every expectation of what a monster should look like. He is 42 years old, clean-shaven, wearing respectable farmer's clothing and spectacles that give him a scholarly appearance. He greets the marshal with complete composure, no trace of fear or guilt in his voice. When Birch presents the federal search warrant, Virgil reads it carefully, then nods and speaks words that will be recorded in the marshal's official report and later repeated at trial. Search all you like. Marshal, you'll find I run a respectable farming operation. Women come here of their own will through honest advertisement, and if they choose to leave, that's their right as free citizens. His calm confidence is more disturbing than panic would be, suggesting either complete innocence or such profound evil that he believes his actions are legally defensible. The deputies search the main farmhouse first, finding nothing unusual for a bachelor farmer's residence. The rooms are orderly, furnished simply but adequately. Religious texts sit on shelves alongside agricultural journals and livestock breeding manuals. The kitchen contains standard provisions. There are no signs of struggle, no hidden rooms, no evidence of captivity. Deputy Frank Morrison later testifies that Virgil followed them through each room, answering questions politely, explaining that his brother Amos lives in a small cabin behind the main house and handles physical labor, since he has been mute since childhood fever. Virgil produces account books showing farm income from livestock and timber sales, receipts for supplies purchased in Galena, correspondence with agricultural suppliers. Everything appears legitimate until Deputy Morrison asks about the barn Lucinda described, located 400 yards into the woods behind the property. Virgil's expression shifts microscopically, a flicker of something cold crossing his face before the mask of respectability returns. He explains it is simply a livestock barn, currently unused since he sold most of his breeding stock last year. He offers to show them personally, but as the group moves toward the tree line, Amos Kern emerges from the woods carrying a hammer, his massive frame blocking the path. He does not speak, cannot speak, but his eyes hold a flat calculation that makes every deputy reach for their weapons. Marshal Birch orders Amos to drop the hammer and step aside. For 30 seconds, Amos simply stares, evaluating whether violence might eliminate the threat these lawmen represent. Finally, Virgil speaks a single word, "Brother," and Amos lowers the hammer and moves aside, though he follows the group toward the barn with predatory attention. The structure emerges from the oak trees, a standard livestock barn approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, built of rough-hewn planks with a tin roof. From the exterior, nothing suggests horror. But when Deputy Morrison forces open the main door, which is secured with 3 separate padlocks, the interior reveals systematic modification for human captivity that makes 2 deputies immediately vomit outside. The barn has been divided into 8 individual stalls, each approximately 5 feet by 7 feet, separated by wooden walls 7 feet high. Each stall contains a rusted iron chain bolted to a support beam, the chains approximately 6 feet long, ending in iron cuffs clearly designed for human wrists. The straw bedding in each stall is fouled and rotted. Tin chamber pots sit in corners. Most damning are the wooden walls themselves, covered in desperate carvings scratched by fingernails or sharp stones. Deputy Morrison copies the legible messages into his notebook. Sarah Whitmore, Boston, June 1879. God send help. Help us, please, God. Margaret Flynn, Philadelphia, 1880. We are 7 here. He kills the pregnant. 8 Hunnis. Marshal Birch orders everything photographed and documented before any evidence is disturbed. The photographer brought from Springfield spends 3 hours capturing images of each stall, each chain, each carved message. These photographs will become trial exhibits that newspaper artists will later reproduce for national audiences, visual proof that human beings were kept as breeding livestock in the Missouri Ozarks. Deputy Morrison collects physical evidence methodically. Hair strands still caught in chain links, fragments of torn fabric, a broken comb, a rusted tin cup. In the northernmost stall, he finds fresher straw and a chain with recently worn metal, confirming this was Lucinda Garrett's prison for 14 months. The bolt she described pulling free is visibly damaged, rust having weakened the metal enough for desperate strength to break it. While deputies document the stalls, Marshal Birch discovers a wooden trunk hidden beneath straw in a corner storage area. Inside are 42 complete sets of women's clothing, each set carefully folded and accompanied by personal items, spectacles, combs, wedding rings, daguerreotypes of families who will never see their daughters again. Each clothing set has a small paper tag pinned to it, written in neat handwriting that matches the farmhouse account books. The tags contain names, dates, and cities of origin. Sarah Whitmore, Boston, arrived June 1879. Margaret Flynn, New York, arrived April 1880. Anna Reinhardt, Street. Louis, arrived March 1882. Birch matches the tags against his missing persons files and finds perfect correspondence. 14 of the 42 names match cases in his cabinet. Every woman in his files is represented in this trunk of trophies, along with 28 others whose disappearances were never officially reported, likely immigrant women or those too poor and isolated for families to file complaints with authorities. The marshal realizes the full scope extends far beyond his documented cases. Virgil Kern has been abducting and murdering women systematically since at least 1877, possibly longer, preserving their belongings like a collector cataloging specimens. Deputy Morrison approaches with another discovery, a wooden crate containing newspaper clippings, each one a matrimonial advertisement placed in Eastern newspapers. 37 clippings in total, spanning 1877 to 1883, all signed with variations of Virgil Kern's name, all using identical language about seeking virtuous wives for a prosperous Missouri farm life. The paper trail is complete, documented evidence of systematic luring spanning 6 years and multiple states, proof of premeditation that will destroy any defense claim of impulsive violence or insanity. Marshal Birch arrests both brothers on preliminary charges of kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and assault while additional investigation proceeds. Virgil maintains his disturbing calm, stating for the record, "These women were purchased through honest advertisement. A man has rights regarding property he acquires legally." Amos remains silent, but his eyes track every deputy with predator attention, calculating violence that never comes. As the brothers are shackled and loaded into a prison wagon for transport to Springfield, Birch asks the question that will haunt the investigation. Where are the bodies? 42 women documented in that trunk, only one survivor accounted for, meaning 41 victims must be somewhere on this property. Lucinda described Amos dragging bodies away at night toward a ravine behind the barn. Deputy Morrison organizes a search party with bloodhounds while the brothers are transported to federal lockup. Within 2 hours, the dogs alert in a wooded ravine 600 yards behind the breeding barn, where disturbed earth and the unmistakable scent of decomposition confirm that the Kern brothers' evil extended beyond captivity into systematic murder. The breeding barn contained the living hell. The ravine contains the dead, and somewhere in that farmhouse there must be records, because men this organized do not operate without documentation. Justice will require finding every receipt, every victim, every piece of evidence that transforms this isolated farm into proof of the most systematic murder operation American law enforcement has yet encountered. November 1883. While Virgil and Amos Kern sit in federal custody in Springfield, refusing to speak except through attorneys who begin constructing an insanity defense, Marshal Birch intensifies the investigation at the farm property, knowing that conviction for murder requires bodies and documentation that proves premeditated, systematic killing rather than isolated violence. Deputy Morrison leads the excavation team to the ravine Lucinda described, a steep-sided gully thick with underbrush where water runoff has carved channels through limestone and clay. The bloodhounds alert repeatedly across a 30-yard section where the earth shows signs of repeated disturbance, darker soil mixed with clay, vegetation patterns broken by something buried beneath. On the 4th of November, 1883, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, a deputy's shovel strikes something solid 3 feet below the surface. It is a human skull, the bone stained dark by years in wet soil, showing a distinctive fracture pattern across the left temple, consistent with blunt force trauma from a heavy instrument. Dr. Hiram Yates, brought from Galena to conduct forensic examination, carefully excavates the remains and documents what he finds in meticulous medical notation that will become primary evidence at trial. The first skeleton is female, estimated age mid-20s based on pelvic structure and dental development. Estimated time since death, approximately 3 to 4 years based on decomposition, state and insect evidence in the soil. Yates photographs the skull fracture from multiple angles, measuring the impact site and noting that the blow came from behind and slightly above, suggesting the victim was struck while kneeling or sitting. Fragments of cloth and a corroded metal button found near the remains match the style of dress common in early 1882, and a small silver locket buried near the rib cage contains strands of human hair, a common Victorian mourning practice where families exchanged hair as keepsakes. The locket will later be identified by Sarah Whitmore's parents as the one they gave their daughter before she left Boston in 1879, physical proof that the breeding barn's carved message and this ravine burial are connected to the same victim. By November 6, the excavation team has uncovered 6 more skeletons in a cluster, all showing identical skull fractures, all positioned in a manner suggesting they were dumped rather than carefully buried, bodies simply rolled into the ravine and covered with enough soil to hide them from casual observation, but not from determined investigation with proper tools. Dr. Yates establishes a systematic documentation process that becomes a model for forensic examination in an era before standardized crime scene protocols. Each skeleton is carefully excavated, photographed in situ, then removed for detailed examination in a makeshift morgue established in a Galena warehouse. Yates measures each skull fracture, documenting the consistent pattern that suggests a single weapon wielded by someone who had perfected their technique through repetition. The fractures are located on the left temple in 32 cases, the right temple in 6 cases, suggesting the killer was right-handed and typically struck victims positioned to his left. Most disturbing are the remains that show signs of pregnancy at death, pelvic structures and small fetal bones indicating these women were killed while carrying the forced pregnancies Lucinda described. 3 skeletons show clear evidence of term pregnancy, meaning Virgil's ledger notation about disposing of infants with their mothers was not metaphorical but literal. By November 18, the excavation has yielded 38 sets of remains, each documented, photographed, and preserved as evidence. 4 women documented in Virgil's trunk of belongings cannot be accounted for in the ravine, suggesting either the bodies were disposed of elsewhere or remain undiscovered in the extensive Kern property. While the excavation proceeds, Marshal Birch continues searching the farmhouse for the documentation he knows must exist. Men this organized, this systematic in their operation, do not function without records. Virgil's visible account books show only legitimate farm business, but Birch has learned from Pinkerton training that criminals who keep records often hide them in obvious places, relying on the assumption that searchers will accept surface legitimacy without deeper investigation. On November 9, Deputy Morrison discovers loose floorboards beneath Virgil's bed, and hidden in the cavity beneath is a leather-bound ledger book, approximately 10 inches by 14 inches, filled with neat handwriting in black ink spanning 137 pages. This ledger transforms the investigation from suspected serial murder into documented proof of the most systematic abduction and killing operation yet discovered in American criminal history. The ledger begins with an entry dated the 15th of January 1877 and contains meticulous records of every woman who arrived at the Kern farm over the subsequent 6.5 years. Each entry follows an identical format that reveals Virgil's mindset with chilling clarity. The first entry reads, "The 15th of January, 1877, Rebecca Stiles arrived, Boston origin, age 24, brown hair, thin build. Total cost $52.25, including advertisement placement, Boston Herald, railway ticket Boston to Springfield, provisions and transport to property, placed stall 1. Purpose: establish breeding program viability. First cycle February, unproductive. Second cycle March, unproductive. Third cycle April, unproductive. Disposed the 3rd of June 1877. Total investment loss recorded. Lesson learned: selection criteria must emphasize youth and rural background for better adaptation to breeding regimen. The clinical language, the financial tracking, the emotionless recording of murder as disposal creates a record that prosecutors will later describe as a confession written in the perpetrator's own hand, proof that Virgil understood exactly what he was doing and documented it with the same care other farmers applied to livestock breeding records. The ledger contains 42 such entries, each woman documented by name, origin, city, physical description, cost of acquisition through advertisement and transportation, assigned stall number, monthly breeding cycle results, and ultimate disposal date when they failed to meet Virgil's productivity standards or became problematic. 3 entries note successful pregnancies carried to term, but each includes the horrifying notation, "Infant disposed with mother due to bloodline contamination concerns." Stock improvement program requires pure frontier lineage, Eastern urban genetics, unsuitable. The ledger confirms that Virgil killed not only the captive women, but also the 3 infants born in that breeding barn, murdered because his twisted eugenic philosophy deemed them genetically inferior. Scattered throughout the ledger are philosophical notations revealing Virgil's justification for his actions. An entry dated March 1879 reads, "Modern scientific farming requires rigorous selection and culling. Women are vessels for producing superior children to populate frontier territories. Those who prove unproductive serve no purpose and represent wasted resources. Biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply is literal commandment applicable to all breeding stock, human and animal alike. Sentiment is weakness that impedes progress." Marshall Birch reads the entire ledger and recognizes it as the most damning piece of evidence any prosecutor could hope to present. Virgil has not only committed systematic murder, but documented every crime with dates, names, methods, and his own philosophical justification, creating an unimpeachable record that will make conviction inevitable. The ledger is photographed page by page, each entry transcribed by 3 separate clerks to ensure accuracy, and the original is preserved as Exhibit A1 for the upcoming trial. Newspaper reporters begin arriving in Stone County as word spreads about the breeding barn discovery, and although Marshall Birch limits information release to prevent prejudicing potential jurors, enough details emerge to create national headlines. Eastern newspapers, where Virgil placed his matrimonial advertisements, begin investigating their own records, discovering that the charming farmer seeking virtuous wives had been advertising in their pages for years, using their publications as hunting grounds for victims. The New York Herald publishes an editorial on November 25 calling for federal regulation of matrimonial advertising, stating, "These newspaper columns enabled systematic predation. We unknowingly facilitated evil by accepting advertisements without verification of identity or intent." Families begin arriving in Stone County from Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and points across the East, having read newspaper accounts and hoping desperately that their missing daughters are not among the 42 victims. Dr. Yates and Marshall Birch establish an identification process using the clothing and personal effects from the trunk, matching items to descriptions provided by families and to missing persons reports filed years earlier. Each identification brings both closure and unbearable grief. Sarah Whitmore's parents identify her spectacles and the silver locket found with her remains. Margaret Flynn's sister identifies a distinctive claddagh ring her mother gave Margaret before she left Ireland. Anna Reinhardt's Lutheran cross necklace is recognized by members of the Street Louis German community who knew her father. By December 1883, 34 of the 38 bodies have been positively identified through personal effects, family recognition of belongings, and correlation with missing persons reports. 4 remain unidentified, likely immigrant women whose families never filed reports or whose belongings provided insufficient distinctive markers for confirmation. The prosecutor preparing the case, District Attorney James Hackett, announces that trial will proceed on 38 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each body recovered, with additional charges of kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and postal fraud for using federal mail systems to lure victims across state lines. The evidence is overwhelming. 38 bodies with identical cause of death, a breeding barn designed for captivity, a trunk full of victims' belongings, matrimonial advertisements traced to the defendants, and most damningly, Virgil's own ledger documenting every crime in his own handwriting with dates and details that match physical evidence perfectly. Justice is coming, documented and undeniable. The 12th of February, 1884. The trial of Virgil Elam Kern and Amos Trask Kern opens in Springfield, Missouri, relocated from Stone County due to security concerns and the impossibility of finding impartial jurors in a community where everyone knows someone connected to the case. The courthouse gallery holds 200 spectators, with another 300 citizens gathered outside, hoping for admission as seats become available. Families of identified victims occupy the first 2 rows, traveling from Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and points across the East to witness justice for their daughters. Judge Marcus Weatherby, a Virginia-trained attorney with 12 years on the Missouri Circuit Bench, presides over what he tells reporters is the most extensively documented murder case in American legal history. The prosecution table holds 37 boxes of evidence: the ledger, the trunk of belongings, photographs of the breeding barn, the chains and personal effects, correspondence files, newspaper clippings, medical reports, and testimony transcripts from 63 witnesses. District Attorney James Hackett opens by telling the jury they will hear testimony and see evidence that confirms beyond any doubt that these defendants operated a systematic abduction and murder enterprise spanning 6.5 years, resulting in 38 confirmed deaths documented through their own meticulous records. The first 4 days belonged to Lucinda May Garrett, the only woman who survived the breeding barn and whose testimony provides eyewitness corroboration for the physical evidence the prosecution will present. She enters the courtroom wearing a modest dark dress provided by a Philadelphia Women's Aid Society, her blonde hair pulled severely back, her composure remarkable for someone about to describe 14 months of captivity and forced breeding to a room full of strangers. She begins with the matrimonial advertisement that lured her to Missouri in 1882, reading from the preserved newspaper clipping introduced as Exhibit C-14. Prosperous Missouri farmer, educated and God-fearing, seeks virtuous wife for building family and civilized life on frontier property. Serious inquiries only from respectable women desirous of marriage and motherhood. She describes her circumstances in Philadelphia. A seamstress earning $4 weekly after her father's death left the family desperate, making Virgil's promises of security seem like answered prayers. The prosecution introduces 6 letters Virgil sent her during their correspondence, each one eloquent and persuasive, discussing literature and scripture, describing his prosperous farm and his desire for educated companionship, never hinting at the horror awaiting her arrival. Lucinda's testimony turns clinical as she describes arriving at the farm in August 1882, meeting Virgil, who seemed kind and educated as his letters suggested, being shown the farmhouse and told their wedding would occur after a week of courtship to satisfy propriety. On her second night, Amos grabbed her from behind as she prepared for bed, dragging her screaming toward the woods while Virgil followed carrying a lantern, explaining in calm tones that she had been purchased for breeding purposes and resistance would only make the situation more difficult. She describes being chained in stall 6, the dimensions exactly matching the photographs introduced as evidence, the iron cuff locked around her left wrist with approximately 6 feet of chain, allowing her to reach the chamber pot and straw bedding, but nothing more. Virgil visited 3 times weekly, always methodical and unemotional, treating the forced sexual assaults as livestock breeding sessions while explaining his philosophy that women were vessels for producing superior frontier children and those who proved unproductive had no value. The gallery sits in stunned silence as Lucinda describes, in matter-of-fact testimony that prosecutors later explain was necessary to prevent emotional breakdown, the routine of her captivity. Twice daily feedings of corn, mush, and water brought by Amos, weekly washing with buckets of cold water, monthly checks by Virgil to determine if breeding had been successful, the terror of hearing other women crying in adjacent stalls. The most harrowing testimony comes on day 3, when Lucinda describes the other women she encountered during her 14 months of captivity. At any given time, 6 to 8 women were chained in the barn, rotated through as some became pregnant, some were killed for failure to conceive, and new victims arrived to take empty stalls. She provides names and descriptions of 5 women she spoke with through the wooden walls separating stalls, women who arrived after her and shared whispered conversations about their families, how they were lured, their desperate hope that someone would notice their absence and investigate. 3 of those 5 names match bodies identified through personal effects. Ellen McCarthy from Boston arrived November 1882, killed March 1883 after 4 months of unsuccessful breeding cycles. Catherine Doyle from Philadelphia arrived January 1883, pregnant when murdered in May 1883. Harriet Lindstrom from New York arrived April 1883, killed July 1883. Lucinda's ability to provide names, physical descriptions, and arrival dates for women she never saw but only heard through walls creates testimony that perfectly corroborates the ledger entries and identified remains, eliminating any possibility she is fabricating her account. The courtroom erupts in gasps when Lucinda testifies about witnessing 3 murders through gaps in the wooden stall walls. She describes Amos entering the barn carrying his hammer, unlocking a woman's chain, leading her outside where Lucinda could see through wall cracks into the adjacent area. The woman would be forced to kneel, and Amos would strike once with the hammer to the left temple, death instant, body going limp, and dragged away toward the ravine in darkness. Virgil supervised these killings, consulting his ledger and announcing which women had failed productivity standards and required disposal. The clinical nature of the murders, the business-like efficiency, the complete absence of anger or passion establishes premeditation beyond any doubt. Defense attorneys object repeatedly, arguing the testimony is inflammatory and prejudicial, but Judge Weatherby rules that the full scope of systematic horror must be presented to the jury to render accurate verdict on the nature of these crimes. Lucinda's final testimony describes her own pregnancy discovered in May 1883, her terror knowing that pregnant women were often killed, and her desperate escape during the October barn fire when a rusted chain bolt finally pulled free after 14 months of gradual weakening through her constant pressure against it. Day 5 through 7 shift to physical evidence presentation, transforming Lucinda's testimony from lone survivor account into documented fact corroborated by medical examination and crime scene investigation. Dr. Hiram Yates takes the stand with 38 sets of skeletal remains documented through autopsy reports that span 247 pages of meticulous medical notation. He presents his findings using actual skulls as demonstrative evidence, a decision that causes several gallery members to faint, but proves devastatingly effective in showing the jury the identical fracture patterns across nearly all victims. Yates testifies that 32 skulls show fractures to the left temple, 6 to the right temple, all consistent with a single blow from a heavy, blunt instrument wielded by a right-handed attacker striking victims positioned to his left side. The fractures match the head of Amos's hammer recovered from the farm and introduced as Exhibit H3, which shows microscopic traces of human bone material embedded in the metal despite attempts to clean it. 3 skeletal remains include fetal bones, proving that pregnant women were indeed murdered, as Lucinda testified, and Yates provides medical testimony that these pregnancies were approximately 6 to 8 months developed, meaning the women carried forced pregnancies for substantial periods before being killed. The prosecution methodically presents the trunk of personal effects, introducing each set of clothing and belongings as individual exhibits, while families in the gallery identify items belonging to their daughters. Sarah Whitmore's parents identify her spectacles and locket. Margaret Flynn's sister identifies the Claddag ring and identifies the handwriting on letters Margaret wrote home that were intercepted by Virgil and preserved as trophies in a wooden box found in the farmhouse. These 73 letters, introduced as Exhibit L1 through L73, provide victim voices describing their captivity, their realization they had been deceived, their pleas for rescue that never came because the letters never reached their intended recipients. The prosecution reads selected letters into the trial record, and the courtroom hears dead women speaking from the grave through their own written words. Dearest mother, I fear I have made terrible mistake coming here. This man is not who he claimed in his letters. I am held against my will and pray you send authorities. Your loving daughter, Catherine. These letters establish not only the victim's suffering, but also Virgil's systematic interception of their attempts to seek help, proving his consciousness of guilt and his deliberate effort to prevent rescue. Days 8 and 9 focus on the ledger itself, the prosecution's most devastating evidence. District Attorney Hackett reads the entire ledger into the trial record, 4 hours of clinical horror as each of 42 entries is documented in court transcript. The jury hears Virgil's own words describing each woman by name, origin city, physical characteristics, costs of acquisition, breeding cycle tracking, pregnancy outcomes, and disposal dates recorded with the emotional detachment of livestock breeding records. The gallery hears entries like November 1880, Ellen Swanson, Chicago origin, age 22, cost $48.50, stall 4, breeding cycles November through February, all unproductive, disposed the 3rd of March 1881, investment loss, $48.50, plus 4 months provisions. The cumulative effect of 42 such entries, read in Virgil's own handwriting visible in the ledger displayed to the jury, creates an undeniable record of premeditated, systematic murder. Defense attorneys attempt to argue the ledger might be fraudulent, planted by investigators, but handwriting experts testify it matches Virgil's known writing in farm account books, letters, and agricultural journal correspondence spanning 15 years. The ledger also contains philosophical notations that reveal Virgil's justification. Women are breeding stock to be selected, utilized, and culled like any livestock. Sentiment is weakness. Productivity determines value. These words in his own hand destroy any possibility of insanity defense by proving he understood his actions and justified them through coherent, if twisted, reasoning. The defense begins its case on day 10 with an inevitable insanity plea, the only possible strategy when evidence of guilt is overwhelming and undeniable. Defense attorney Robert Halloran calls 2 physicians who never examined the defendants but offer theoretical testimony that Virgil's systematic record-keeping and breeding philosophy suggest delusional religious mania divorced from reality. The prosecution dismantles this argument methodically by presenting evidence of Virgil's calculated consciousness of guilt. He hid the ledger beneath floorboards. Rather than displaying it proudly, he intercepted victims' letters to prevent families from learning the truth. He paid Sheriff Mundy with livestock and grain to discourage investigation of missing women complaints, and he isolated his property 18 miles from the nearest settlement, specifically to avoid observation. These are not actions of a delusional man unaware of societal prohibitions, but of a calculating predator who understood his actions violated law and morality and took systematic steps to avoid detection. The defense attempts to portray Amos as a man of diminished capacity due to his muteness and perceived simple-mindedness, arguing he merely followed his brother's orders without understanding the criminality of murder. This argument collapses when prosecutors introduce evidence of Amos's sophisticated carpentry modifications to the breeding barn, including custom stall construction, chain mounting systems designed for human restraint, and concealed access points to the ravine disposal site, all demonstrating advanced planning ability inconsistent with diminished mental capacity. On day 11, closing arguments crystallize 6 weeks of testimony and evidence into final appeals to the jury's judgment. District Attorney Hackett stands before the 12 men holding 42 women's lives in their hands and speaks words preserved in the 847-page trial transcript. Gentlemen of the jury, you have heard testimony from the only woman who survived this breeding barn. You have seen photographs of chains that held human beings like livestock. You have examined personal effects belonging to daughters whose families traveled 1,000 miles, hoping desperately you would render justice. You have heard medical testimony about 38 skulls fractured by systematic execution. You have seen letters written by dead women begging for rescue that never came because the defendant intercepted their pleas. And most damningly, you have heard the defendant's own ledger read into this record, 137 pages documenting every abduction, every forced breeding cycle, every murder, written in his own hand with the clinical detachment of a farmer culling unproductive stock. This ledger is confession, documentation, and proof combined into a single devastating exhibit. Virgil Kern understood exactly what he was doing. He planned it systematically. He executed it methodically. He documented it meticulously. And he felt no remorse, viewing women as breeding animals to be purchased, utilized, and disposed of when they failed to meet his productivity standards. Amos Kern served as enforcer and executioner, killing at least 26 women with a hammer in identical fashion, perfecting his technique through repetition. These are not insane men. These are evil men who deserve the full punishment that law and justice demand. Defense attorney Halloran makes a desperate final plea for mercy based on alleged mental defect, but his words ring hollow against the mountain of evidence proving calculated intent. The jury receives instructions from Judge Weatherby on the 23rd of February, 1884, retiring to deliberate 38 counts of first-degree murder along with additional charges of kidnapping and postal fraud. The deliberation lasts 90 minutes, suggesting not uncertainty, but merely the time required to complete paperwork for 38 separate counts. When the jury returns, Foreman Samuel Bradford reads the verdict that families have traveled weeks to hear. On all 38 counts of murder in the first degree, we find the defendants Virgil Elam Kern and Amos Trask Kern guilty as charged. The courtroom erupts in applause and weeping as victims' families embrace, knowing their daughters' deaths will be answered with legal punishment rather than impunity. Judge Weatherby allows the emotional release for several minutes before restoring order and addressing the defendants for sentencing. His words, preserved in court records, deliver the moral judgment that evidence demanded. You gentlemen treated human beings as livestock, documented your evil with the pride of a stock breeder recording his herd improvements, and showed no remorse, even when confronted with the bones of 42 women whose only crime was trusting your false promises. This court finds no mitigating circumstances, no mental defect that excuses, no mercy warranted. You shall be hanged by the neck until dead, and may God have more mercy on your souls than you showed those women. The 16th of May, 1884. Springfield's public square fills with 3,000 spectators, the largest execution crowd in Missouri history, gathering to witness justice delivered publicly as frontier custom demands. A double gallows has been constructed in the center of the square, 2 nooses hanging side by side, the trapdoors tested repeatedly to ensure simultaneous operation. Families of identified victims occupy spaces near the platform, wanting to see the final moment when their daughters' murders are answered with legal execution. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Virgil and Amos Kern are led from the county jail in chains, their hands bound, their faces showing no emotion, even as the crowd shouts condemnation. Sheriff's deputies maintain order as the brothers are walked up the 13 steps to the gallows platform, positioned over the trap doors, and offered final statements according to legal custom. Virgil speaks, his voice carrying across the silent square, words that newspapers will print in scandalized headlines the following day. "I'd done no different than breeding hogs. They was purchased fair through advertisement. A man has a right to improve his stock through selective breeding. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Future generations will vindicate my methods when science proves I was ahead of my time." His complete lack of remorse, his continued justification of murder as agricultural improvement, confirms the jury's verdict that these were not insane ravings, but coherent evil defended through twisted reasoning. Amos remained silent as he lived, his muteness preventing final words, but his cold eyes scanning the crowd until the moment the black hood is placed over his head. The executioner checks the nooses, confirms the knots are properly positioned behind each brother's left ear for instant cervical fracture, and signals readiness to Judge Weatherby, who authorized the execution and witnesses its completion to ensure legal propriety. At precisely 2:14 in the afternoon, the trapdoors spring open simultaneously, both brothers dropping through, the ropes snapping taut with the distinctive crack of breaking necks. The crowd releases a collective sound, part relief and part grim satisfaction, as the 2 bodies swing motionless, death instantaneous according to the attending physician, who monitors for 8 minutes before declaring life extinct at 2:22. According to frontier execution custom, the bodies remain displayed for 6 hours, allowing all citizens to witness that justice has been completed and evil has been eliminated. Families file past the gallows throughout the afternoon, some weeping, some standing in silent witness, all knowing their daughters' murders have been answered with the maximum penalty that law permits. The bodies are cut down at 8 in the evening and transported to the Missouri State Prison Cemetery, where unmarked graves have been prepared per court order, specifying that no monuments shall preserve the defendant's memory. They are buried in pine boxes without ceremony, the graves identified only by numbered wooden stakes in prison records, ensuring that Virgil and Amos Kern will be forgotten while their victims are honored. Sheriff Horace Mundy, Stone County's corrupt enabler who accepted bribes and dismissed complaints, has already been convicted in a separate trial and serves his own sentence in federal prison, his failure to investigate enabling years of additional murders beyond when intervention could have stopped the killing. The legal proceedings demonstrate that justice extends beyond primary perpetrators to include those whose corruption or negligence facilitated evil, establishing precedent that law enforcement officials who fail their duty share culpability for resulting crimes. Marshal Clayton Birch, whose methodical investigation and refusal to accept political pressure ensured full exposure of the breeding barn horrors, writes in his final case report filed with federal authorities. This case proves that isolated evil, no matter how systematic or concealed, cannot survive exposure to truth and law. The ledger itself, the perpetrator's own documented confession, ensured justice. Let this serve as warning. Evidence speaks louder than silence, and those who document their evil provide their own condemnation. In 1886, 2 years after the executions, Springfield Cemetery unveils a marble monument funded by Marshal Birch and contributions from victims' families, listing all 42 names with their birth dates and hometowns, ensuring they are remembered as individuals rather than statistics. The inscription reads, "In memory of 42 women who suffered in the Kern Brothers breeding barn, 1,877 to 1,883. They came seeking honest marriage and found only death. Evil was exposed, justice was served. May their courage light the path for future victims." The Stone County Historical Society establishes an annual remembrance ceremony held each October 23, the date Lucinda Garrett escaped and triggered the investigation that brought justice. Lucinda herself returns to Philadelphia after the trial, marries a clerk named Samuel Morton, who courted her, despite scandal attached to her testimony about sexual violence, and has 3 healthy children, proving that survival and rebuilding are possible after unimaginable trauma. In 1891, she publishes her memoir, 600 Days in the Breeding Barn, My Captivity and God's Deliverance, donating all proceeds to organizations fighting human trafficking, transforming her suffering into activism that protects future potential victims. She lives to age 75, dying peacefully in 1934, surrounded by grandchildren, having turned horror into purpose and ensuring the 41 women who did not survive are never forgotten. The Kern property itself is seized by the state and the breeding barn demolished in 1885 by victims' families who travel from the east specifically to destroy the structure with their own hands, each family member striking walls and support beams with sledgehammers in therapeutic destruction that newspapers document with photographs. The foundation stones are left visible as warning, and the site becomes state conservation land with a historical marker erected in 1994 stating, "Site of Kern Brothers Atrocities, 1,877 to 1,883. 42 women vanished here. One survivor's courage brought justice. Evil was exposed. Justice was served." The complete trial transcript, 847 pages documenting every piece of evidence and testimony, is archived at Missouri State Archives in Jefferson City, where researchers can examine the case that established precedents for prosecuting systematic serial murder. Virgil's ledger, preserved as Exhibit A1, remains available to scholars by appointment, a chilling reminder that perpetrators who document their evil provide prosecutors with perfect evidence for conviction. The Kern case becomes training material for law enforcement agencies studying patterns of isolation-based predation, and the FBI references it in modern human trafficking education as historical proof that systematic evil can be exposed and punished when survivors speak and investigators refuse to accept surface legitimacy without thorough examination of evidence beneath.